Pimpon Doshen Bezon Zojo Nen Dashi Den Yang Den Den Le Zhong Sa Ji Bechen Zhong Men Lo Zhang Shi Zhang Lin Jin Nin De Jian Bo San Jie Xin Du Men De Wei Wang Yi Zhu Gun Nang Da Jin Xue Bo Zhu Yi Dong Ma Gu Zhu Rang Nang Mang Zhe Lo Ni Yang Dong Yang Men
San Jie
Xue Dang Zhong Jie Zhong Nang Lo Zhang Zhu Mo Du Zhang Ni
Ya Su Che
Da Ge Xu Jun Ji Ben Cong Nam Jian Zhong La Ben Jie San Jian Zhou Ba Ra
Sho San Jie Jo Da Zai Sana La
Jian Zhu Ban Du Dang Ni Jiang Zhu Jian Da Ge Xu Jun Ji Ben Cong Nam Jian Zhong La
Ben Jie
San Jian Zhou Ba Ra
Sho San Jie Jo Da
Zhou Jie Zhong Nang Lo
Jiang Jo Ba
Du
Do
Dang Ni
Jiang
Jiang Zhu
Zhu
Jian
Che
Da Ge Xu Jun Ji Ben Cong Nam Jian Zhong La Ben Jie
San Jie Jo Ba Ra Sho Kan Ge Tu De Ni Re Su Ne Ta Wa Tu Ni Ban De Ji Re Dan De Ju Ne Tu Godam De La Cha De Lo Kan Ge Tu De Ve Ni Re Su Ne Wa Da Wa Dan Ji Ban De Ji Re Dan De Su Ne Dong De Godam De La Cha De Lo Kan Ge Ni Re Su Da Wa Dan Ji Ban De Ji Re Dan De Su Ne Dong De Godam Ma De La Ba Cha Ba De Lo Kan Ge Tu De Ni Re Su Ne De Su Ne Dong De Godam De La Cha De Lo Kan Ge Tu De Ni Re Su Ne Da Wa Dan De Su Ne Dong Godam De La Cha De Vaya da topjalana meba. Yanda ba tobe sanje ji kumbaran boji jene jan tobar cha. Te tobar chabi sirdu. Ane jabi songrab samje ji ne duba. Changju lamje druma. Changji lamje rimba. O senyan be tene kono kunju ji rimba nam. Lakwa se ta de sembar hyus.
Let us cultivate bodhicitta motivation or the altruistic motivation seeking complete enlightenment for the benefit of all other sentient beings. And with that kind of motivation, we should participate in this Lamrim teaching, teaching on the stages of path leading to enlightenment. And Lamrim brings together all the essential points of practice that can help us to become enlightened beings.
다 간슈야 담배 취지 참니 각장 랑ring 활동 제모 각장 운동이 드네마 초버적이 단데 가르산 디가tuk 델리도와 단데 있잖아 네트워크도 봐 십자 네트워크도 봐 리도가 어다 가르속에서는 대대성도와 다 공득샵에 대해 랑king 오토베 주제 테나세도와 그 간데르 세비 있는 주제 테나 랑기 아니 베베 주제 테나 나길로 온게 자고 멤버 랑king 오건이 유팅도 줘봐 텔라 다감 라신시 세라 다 가자 둡두들 봐 가자 둡두들 간데르스나 다 마시게 젠라 마랄 말레시아로 옹게시아로 휴타르 바테 콜 휴타르 다감데 가르스나 단 도르투는 르 옹게 아니 샵가 멤버지 랑게 거니 유딩도 다 전화기 주는 여기 거니 유딩도 줘봐 달라 아니 다 감들이 각제 다감 아니 비게 주다세 한다다 가사 단지스나 주다스나 어디 다 간제 각제 다 됐으기 송도와 어디 송버래
So we are back to special insight section, Vipassana section from the great Lamrim text. And we have been dealing with identifying objects of negation or what needs to be negated or refuted in order to understand and realize the ultimate nature of phenomena. And so we are on page 213, volume number 3 in English translation, and we're in the middle paragraph where the paragraph starts with, therefore, what exists objectively in terms of its own essence without being posited through the power of a subjective mind is called self or intrinsic nature. As Khensur Rinpoche explained, we are trying to understand what is intrinsic existence or intrinsic nature. Okay? That's not really there in reality. What is it? Because that really is what we call identifying object of negation. Okay? So what criteria do we have to hypothetically assert that if something were to exist intrinsically, and then how should it really exist? Well, that's what we really need to understand. And as it is stated there, intrinsic nature should mean that something exists from its own side, in and objectively, without being posited its existence from subjective point of view. Okay? So that is really basically what we're talking about, intrinsic reality or the object of negation. Does something exist? Could something exist in and of itself, objectively, right, from its own side, very independently and objectively, without relying upon any subjective perception or subjective mind? Okay? And such existence is just impossible. Okay? So trying to understand that is really trying to understand what we mean by intrinsic existence. So often when we talk about self of a person and self of phenomena, that self is really to be understood as intrinsically existent self or intrinsic self. And that self, if it were to exist, then it would have to exist on its own, very independently, right, without having anything to do with what calls subjective perception or subjective mind. No.
다 공도 쉐베 애니 테스고 다 감면서 당가르바 남가르와 다 감면 라신기 애니 비게 매바티 라신기 애니 비게 라시 가자 들어봤다 강자 강제 각자티 애니 쓰게요 다 각자티 컨데스 각자티 샤니 각자 ten이 애니 체시 가사 그땡도 매바니 가사 그 다음에 베스 제 각자티 주비 동안 그 체시 내지 쇼다 가사 니스 예베 송세의 체시 내지 가사 그 다스니 찍다 초기 다스니지 제 체시내기 제 다도 마두버들라 강사가 다음에보다 초기 다음에 어디 체시내기 마도 제라 각자를 강야 제버려 말이 센다 공도 망고 휴사를 때리 대가리 어 체시내기 제리 팅 체시내기 된데 강사가 땡도 매봐 강사가 다음에보다 명나소지 땡도 애니 매봤네 초기 다음에봐 송배스다 어다 딘데리 다음에 니세야 딘 남배 형님 제베 담이 니 세야게 담이 니 다 주지 담에다 가사게 담이 니 송버리스 어디 근데 송배 다 담이 니 근데 송윤도 발라 송배 세라와 세다 자윤도 란신티 근데 게 아니게 가사게 가사다 주지 땡도 매배 란신티 가사도 주지 땡도 주지 땡도 유브란 zem반니 단지 서봐 단지니 이진 zem바라 임바 쭉게 또 뉴스 다 체시내지 가사게 다 담이 세야지다 추지 담이 세야지 땐 파베 다야 체시내지 가사게 다도 두번 zem바다 추지 다도 zem바데 공도 셰비 체시내지 담이니 그 슉게 안에 된 zem바데 단지니 이게 레이스 센투 슉을 고고를 송거 레이스
So in Buddhist teachings and literatures, we often talk about two selflessnesses or two types of selflessness, dharma.
In terms of what it is or what they are, there is no difference. Yes, it is not that one of the selflessnesses is more subtle or subtle than the other. Yeah? It's just the same. However, from the what we call the point of the basis upon which we establish selflessness, we can talk about two types of selflessness. When we take person as the basis, then we can talk about selflessness of a person or persons. And when we take phenomena as basis, then we can talk about selflessness of phenomena. But as selflessnesses, they are one and the same thing. There isn't any slightest difference. Right? Of course, my first note, this is from Prasangika Madhyamika point of view, right? That's what we are talking about, the framework. And so implicitly, as we talk about two types of selflessness, implicitly, we are also really talking about two types of self which constitute objects of negation, if you will. Okay? So if we take person as the basis, and if we were to perceive person as existing in and of himself or herself or themselves without being dependent upon any subjective perception, then that has to be recognized as intrinsic nature of person or intrinsic self of person. Usually we call self of a person. We even don't use the adjective intrinsic, but that has to be understood. Now, if we change the basis and we focus on phenomena such as eyes and ears and a nose and whatever, and then we see them as existing in and of themselves, objectively, right, 100%. Well, the text doesn't say 100%, but I just throw that one in, right? 100%, from its own side, without being dependent upon, any subjective perception, then that has to be recognized as intrinsic nature of phenomena or self of phenomena. Okay? Now, do these selves exist? The answer is not at all. Okay? But then why are we really talking about these things, something that don't exist, is because even though such selves don't exist, but we believe that they do exist because we fabricate such selves, and then we believe in their existence. So therefore, we have graspings at the self of a person and grasping at the self of phenomena. Okay? Because these graspings do exist. Even though the selves we grasp at don't exist, we fabricate it, and we even forgot we fabricated it. Okay? But the graspings exist. So in order to uproot the graspings, we need to realize selflessnesses of persons and phenomena.
What that is that name my Kong the Kebe any Tenzin Tamini say and Tenzin say at the Kong the Kariora, Sung the Sarita, Kong the Kariora, Senata, Till Kong Yoris, Hijabi, any big Kong use. Hijabi comes on it, Kong Yuna, Hijabi comes to condense Stumber Sebina, Telatati Chavanes, Kangong Namji, Hela Ramalevi Mote. Te mebane, ta meba o sentati, hijabi tigrava, yoti ta mebaris. Oh, Kana Taji Chavi, Ngobonam Jiran, Shella Ramalve Ngote, Katad Serava. Te mebane, Chesi Karina, Kazak Tingrina, Chujitan Kudina, Tini Mebati, Kazak Tameris. Teni Shura Kazak Nis to talk this, Chesi Neki, Nis Tati. Metembarimento several to Odua. Means to talk the church dame, but a Kazakh dame of he chow, he sung bataros, and Dortuna any Chehinegi take or Carta Tamini, the Tanzini say at the Kunda, the Karizana, Hijabalea, Hijabi at the sung, but the Kung Tambres.
So now if we were to ask, is there a scriptural, evidence, where all these things are really being mentioned, And as a matter of fact, yes, there are. And on page 213, towards the bottom, there is a passage quoted from great Arya Deva's 400 stanzas on the middle way called Chatuksheda. Yeah? And that really, actually, the passage itself is quite clear, that you could understand without much explanation. And I quote, 400 stanza says, self is an essence of things that does not depend on others. It is an intrinsic nature. The non-existence of that is selflessness. Because of the division into objects and persons, it is understood as twofold: a selflessness of objects, which are usually called selflessness of phenomena, and a selflessness of persons, unquote. So it's quite clearly stated that even though those two selves don't exist in reality, but from the way we look at things, from that point of view, so we could talk about self of a person, intrinsic nature of a person, or self of phenomena or objects, or intrinsic nature of objects. Okay? And then we have those two graspings. So to uproot the graspings, then we really need to understand the selfless nature of phenomena and persons. So therefore, selflessnesses of persons and objects of phenomena are presented.
어디 공기 되고 있어. 다디 점대 양가서 송도잖아. 계속 간사랑 게 팀이 두번 좀 받게 애니 비게 간사 그 단진 가서 다든 좀 봐인 봐 미릭대. 현주나 애니 간사 현 남라 맥네랑 게 팀이 두번 좀 받게양 간사 그 단진 줄고도. 대치랑 되어 있나니스. 대치랑 되어 있다니 지도를 따온 줄고도 진짜이 고도 쓰러봐. 지도를 가서 지도를 따온 줄고나 telane ngau nya ma de jida merik becharo hena chen ta de ta pube ke chen zuba ko sire tala zuba ko sire ta inje menji zuba ko sire da yende yene dan da de kalsar konjan ro chu song ne karis kong ge arasana de song ge doga kondu shebe kansa ke da me ba de chuje da me ba de re sen ten pa ba ba de pa yin da ta ti karis ge arasana 걔들랑기 ten이 주반 좀 배서봐. 걔들 간사랑기 ten이 주반 좀 배서데 간사 단디 셰셔 된 느낌도 송겨야 돼. 고자나게 되게 된 느낌도. 된 민족이야 그 주된 가르쳐 버렸잖아. 코랑 공부 시단지를 주된 가르쳐 버리는 된 메릭때 대이나 이 간사 그달 아니 왜 간사 견을 민이랑 ten이 주반 좀 반지 좀 맞지. 간사 그 단디 결국도 왔. 간사 단디 줄고도 왔. 대 간사 단디 이나니 아니 직다 리고도 왔. 코랑 직다 생이 되게 리고도 직다 인번 줄어. 된 직다 인번 주나니 아니 될라 아니 직다 생이 될라. 란주지 갈면 나오 냥고지 로치고 말해 배. 현주길 맨에 간사랑기 ten이 주반 좀 받지 직다니 생각이 그냥 민두가 진짜 두저바 듣고 그래. 간사 단디 바 미릭때 말이 어디야 미릭때 세르와 고바테네 나오냐면 메베 미릭소 해나 세르 다디 쪼바치 다 쪼바치 어다 알리 쪼바치 귀하나 어다 코노게 간사 디 쪼바 관계디 가리 곰브르잖아 간사 그 단디는 직다인 베페치 차파진 두고 알다 그런 게야 그런 공부 시장으로부터 간사 그 단지 인sel라 생이텔라 직다인비 탑고도 성고티 시가제네 조바고 용바레스.
So at the bottom of page 213, there is a qualm or raised or a question asked. In Tibetan language we say a debate has been presented, right? And the response is on the back of that page. So what is the question that's being asked here? Maybe somebody really asked that question, or it's just hypothetically kind of constructed question. The question here is, here the critic says, one cannot consider what called seeing a person's in and of themselves, as the same as grasping at the self of a person or the conception of self of a person. Okay? The reason that is, he said, if that were the case, then when you look at other people, other persons, and see them as intrinsically existent or existing by way of their own characteristics, then that conception also has to be considered as grasping at the self of a person. Okay? So in which case, you had to accept that all such conceptions constitute what we call the view of transitory collection. The Tibetan term is called jikta, the transitory view. Okay? And so are these conceptions transitory view or not, right? He is kind of asking that question. And if you say yes, then you say, you know what, well, isn't transitory view understood as being focused on, right, your own personal self, right? Not on the self of other people, but focused on, one's own self. Okay? So it's really not working. Okay? So the critique here, the assumption is that if something is to be considered as grasping at the self of a person, that it must necessarily be, right, the view of transitory collection. I know it's a technical term. You get jikta in Tibetan. Okay? And if that assumption is correct, right, then what has been said earlier, he said it does not hold water. It's not making sense. How could you say that grasping at the self of other people's selves, right, how could that be the transitory view? Because the transitory view is usually understood as focused on one's own self, not on other people's self. Do you see the, the critique coming from? Okay, that's the question being raised. No.
다들 공자수 강사 되게 공자 나야 되다. 강사 그단들 진짜 인구도 섬들하게 공부시대 공자도 나야 되다. 다 발행 가르쳐 게 알았으면 대송도가 대련 바 가르송도잖아. 강사를 랑신 요브란 zem반에 나르케바 따라 강사랑게 강사랑신 게 요브라 강사랑신 게 요바 강사 그 다음에 또 송배 대나라 송타르스티 강사랑신 저번 zem반에 강사 그 단지 임바 매스케는 세게 와 말이 네 나르 셰브나신 게 켈랭게 와래 있어봐. 랑신 요바 강사 그 송배 강사 그 단지 tundu goso tit kerangi 강사 그 단지 마이츠는 시세고야 요 말이 그랑루 이나야 티 강사 단지 누구든 알게 따라 강사 단지 누구이 레디 인에 원장 강사 그 단지 두 강사 그 다든 짐발라 지게 마차바 인노 kerangi 공과 티테티 공과 튜브리다 강사 그 단지는 직달이 거버디 kerangi 숭야티 레디오 말이 티 노두스 마트 심바리 내 가르쳐는 저랑 숭야디 강사 그 단지 임바탄 두기 유티 이내야 강사 그 단지는 예 직다 임바티 켈레 고기 매진 와다 렌좀 바티 렌좀 바리
So this lady sungor wa shengi tal ming ne zembedia kansa tangzen res
오 코난 뜻은 거 알아 이
man majo ranglu ki sungor ba da
랑로 그 뜻은 거 말아
man konang sundu ka ke zubnge de ha gos pena kansa tangzen ine jigde ki chabal ling gor wa di labde kala ene kansa shengi tal ming ne zembade an jigda re bas gor wa di jigda yo shengi marwa kona
디 직다 있나 나오냐 버들 로 민도 가
디 타이네 ranglu le ya kansa tangzen ina jigda ingbe chepge mares pena kansa shengi tal me be tangze dia ani 가르쳐라. 당진에 직다 말했어.
가사 그 단지리 직다 말이. 와다 뜻을 정겨. 도도도 버티.
I just want to make sure that I understood, which I think I did, and I'm glad the green signal is on. So on page 214, right on the top, it says reply. So in our system, now the critics asked that question, right? So we had to respond to that. We are a debater here. He said, yes, we have not changed our positions. We have said from whenever we said it, that if you see self of persons as existing in and of itself without being dependent on others, especially subjective perception, and that has to be considered as self of persons. And grasping at that self is considered as grasping at the self of persons. Okay? So we do not regard that all the graspings at self of a person must necessarily be focused on one's own self, or what we call the transitory view. Okay? So we said, maybe you stress your assumption a little too much, because you are assuming, we're telling the critique, you assume that grasping at self or person must necessarily be like transitory view. But we don't agree with that, we said that, when a person grasps at the self of another person as existing in and of itself, we also consider that as grasping at self of person. But that is really not the transitory view. We know that, because it's not focused on yourself. Do you see the difference, distinction? Yeah. You're all very smart. I took a while to understand that one. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's what man. Oh, that is just all Tarchera. That one dictates any in Zimbabwe, Chandra was you go in Yamnas. Ah, no, dictating in the condition. He make back condition, the back condition. Dictating in the Jawala. Chechu of the condition tango days in Yamna, that company in Asir. That is the Tiwati, Tiwas and a Tongdit of Tia, Tongdit is based on one and dictate at Tenzin and Chandra was you go in Yamnas. That is Tongdit of Tia. That tell it. The telecarson, Jita Kunda, Zimbala, Mambu Kiwi, Tavangashi, Ki, Pungol and Migne, Tatun Zembra, never Menayans. That it is Kokati do Menayas, the Kokab to the Inaya Taya. Jita Tele Kunda in Chekdal, Henry in New York is Kunda Tabuti, Rande, Shrama with Tavang, any pigating, Mambu Kiwi, Tavasing to any Pungol Tatun Zembra. Kansa Pumbo Tatun Zimbabwe, Tinisi, Korangria, Pumboya, Pumbola Tag with Dennis, Tatu, the Malabache, Pumbo Koraya, Tatu Zimbabwe, Sigmund Rosanta, in the Kokabata, Mambuki with Tawang, Gashiki, Ravan Gashiki, Pumbola being the Tatun Zimbabwe, never Menayans. Take Caritana, Jitake, the Netan, Satans read to give Mare Sungmendo, Menayans, Rava. Jital Henji ni use, Jital Henji ni any Henji, Jital Henji ni Jobangs, Pungola make the cartings, Jitasin you take Pungola make Mari. Now I make the Nawala so the Pungola make the Jitativa Revetana, Mari is Sunga, Pungo, Jite make the Mari. Pungo show the Kansa needs to be churi Madochella, show the Kansa needs to be any Kansa Mari. Pungoterava, Kansa to Pungo in a show the Kansa needs to be churi Mado, Pungoti Margo, Kansa Hiti or Maris. Jeta Gardens, the Gargadus, Debra and Tenny Tag with Tag in a make for a song bear, Pungola make bear. Pungola make bear. That's in the Dante, Carrica said in a trouble with it. He took. She pretty, said Atlantic, Sungin and chicken. Pungola song bear, Pungola make bar, Michichis, Jitatic Pungola make for the Michichis, no. That here and a caressana, Kansa some chigla, make by what? What are sure the Kansa Nive. Kansa some make for the mato, sure the Kansa yes, Pungola make for Mare, Sene, what the Tangi TV, Jig Candesco, Jiminum Candesco, the Tewatic, Land to jump at Nampimatra.
Kansa some say the Kansa some say because the Pungola Tabe, Kansa some de la Mini, you don't see the Bazinga Suture.
Oh, really, Pungo make for Maris, Pungo tug with Taki, Pungo tug with Kansa some make for it.
So we are on page 214, right on the top. This is a part of the response or reply. So then maybe the critic asks back, what is the transitory view or the view of transitory collection? In that English translation, it says, what is needed in order to have a conception of self that is a view of the perishing aggregates, right? That's the jigta, perishing aggregates. Usually we translate as the view of transitory collection. Okay. So what is it? What is its focus? What conditions should be met for us to be able to, recognize the transitory view, if you will. And so as a response to that, first we have to acknowledge that there are two what called forms of transitory view or the view of transitory recollection. These are so long to repeat in English, the terms. Why can it be like Tibetan jikta? This so maybe I should say there are two forms of jikta. So one is the intellectual form, quinta, and the other is the innately developed form. Okay, lenje is something innate to you. So in the case of intellectual form of jikta, for example, one of the sub-schools perhaps of Vaibhashika, because in Buddhism we talk about different schools of tenets or thoughts, right? That's called Chedapa, right? The Vaibhashika. And there is a sub-school called Samitya school. Yeah. So they assert, for example, that the aggregates of a person constitute the self. Okay? All of us have 5 aggregates, right? They said, what is person? Well, person is the aggregates themselves, right? The 5 aggregates or the aggregates are the self. Yeah? So that kind of a grasping at the aggregates as the self, which is intrinsic in this case, it is the intellectual form of transitory view or jikta according to them. Okay? But according to our system, no, that cannot be jikta at all. That cannot be transitory view because aggregates are considered as phenomena, right? When we categorize everything that exists into 2 kinds, persons and phenomena, aggregates are phenomena, not persons. Okay? So therefore, that self cannot be the self of a person. So that's not acceptable to our school of thought. So what is jikta, transitory view, in our school of thought, if you will? So it is the innately developed, right, conception, the lenje, the one inborn, if you will, innately developed one. And it is not focused on the aggregates of a person. It is simply focused on person, themselves or himself or herself. Yeah. So I checked with the Khensur Rinpoche, what is that person now, right? What is the person? Well, person is a designation, right? Person is that which is designated onto the collection of his or her aggregates. Yeah? So that person is taken as the focus by jikta and then sees that person as existing in and of himself or from his own side. Okay? So that is considered as the jikta, the view of transitory collection, not the one focused on the aggregates as the person or the self. Yeah? So that's our explanation to the critique.
다시 대양 어원에 벤서 밖에 힐 주베 간사지 괴베 주현지 간사라 간사니 맥바 매너 단지 따스니 뜻이요. 아주 단지 최지 단지다 간사 그 단지 니제 간사 그 단지 틀라야 아니 비게 직따스야 직도와 뒤나래야 직따스니 직따스니 거 제가 직따스니한테 가르치기 알았잖아. 간제질라 집에 ngao nyamba inanda kare ngayin tembe jikta inanda ya ngayo an tembe jikta inanda ko mikba tela ngao nyamba jiku yares ngao nyamba jiku gri mato khansa khenle mikba te jikta ri yo mare khansa khenle me ngao nyamba yo marwa sungi do ade ngao nyamba chin temba jewe hir jewe ta tinde ji hir jane ngao nyamba ji hir jane khansa ji gobe 근데 그거를 맞도록 주현을 맥바테 진짜 따와니네 되게 말해 진짜야 내모체는 발에 직접 받는게도 주현을 맥바테 나오냐 봐 매번 인간 직다리 두고 말해 진 렌직 좀 받나샤.
So what is jikta or transitory view in our own system of thoughts, if you will? Jikta for us means that it has to be focused on, one's own self. And it could not be focused on the selves of other people. Okay? And so in our school, we make a difference between graspings of self of persons and jikta. Okay? We could have grasping at the self of other people, okay, but that's not the jikta, transitory view. the jigta, transitive view, must be focused on one's own self. Okay? The jigta of self of phenomena has to be focused on one's own aggregates, not other people's aggregates. Okay? So other people's selves do not constitute the focal point of jigta, transitive view. They could constitute the self, grasping at the self, focus of grasping self, but not the transitory view. Okay? So that's the kind of clarification being offered, as you can see towards the end of that big paragraph from top, page 214. Let me read it, where it says, hence, an innate view of the perishing aggregates, jigta, does not take the aggregates as its object of observation, but rather observes the mere person. So person is the object of jigta. Moreover, it must be a person who is a basis for the arising of the thought I. That means it refers to one's own personal self. Right? My jigta is focused on myself, my in the sense you are translated, if we take that as an example. Right? Thus, a person of another continuum of mental and physical aggregates is not the object of observation. So in other words, that jigta only focuses on the self that is conjoined with one's own consciousness mind. Okay? The self that is conjoined with other people's consciousnesses, that self cannot be the focus of jigta, okay, or the transitory view. Okay.
Oh yeah, me what la chidran zimbe number ni ta kande me what ta ngao nyamba nga ranju ji nga le me ngao nyamba ji me what ku yo re ba ta ona me what ti na ko din tan ji ten din tan kar ra se ne sung bai na sung bi sara wa ta me what de la chidra ine zimbe chidran zimbe number ni kare ko tan jung pa jugben de ba le rande ra ba jugben rande le kande sung sana telan ji zo na ta wa ni nga ta nge nyamba tetabu namba chin super shi sungbe rangi tini ji yubar rangi tini drube rangi yu tam dun zimba menji chita rangi tini druban zimbe rangi yu tam zimba tin jikta ribe tan te mare kondi sheba na hingi eni pikin chungde kapsu sheba na hingi tela eni jikzo le tawa ti nga ta nga nyamba tetabu namba tinde chi kukri madwa chigla rangi tini ji druban zimba tam ji te ani pige che nga ine nga rang thing to ban dem tam ji te ji ta ri tu kyo mar nga o nyam bu gu yo are chen o ti chi sung gu sar ba no to chen.
So if self, one's own self is the focal point of jigta, the transitory view, then how does this view or the jigta sees the self? Right? How does it apprehend it? What is its subjective relationship, if you will, to the self? Now, as Chandrakirti states in his explanation of the middle way commentary in the middle of page 214, I quote, concerning that, a view of the perishing aggregates operates within thoughts of I and mine, and unquote. Okay. So explanation given on that is that, every case of grasping at intrinsic self of reality does not necessarily constitute jigta, transitory view. Okay? Because the jigta, transitory view, is specifically focused on one's own self. The self that is you experience, you conjoined with your consciousness, not other people's consciousness. Okay? And so that is important for us to realize, as much as we talk about how there is no such thing as intrinsic reality, we try to refute it, right? But grasping at intrinsic reality in general, okay, does not necessarily constitute jigta, transitory view. So there are, classifications within that grasping, if you will. And so it says, so when we as people focus on our own self, take that self as the focal point and sees it as intrinsically existent, then that grasping is the jigta view. Okay? Or when we look at our own aggregates, right, and see them as intrinsically existent, that could be jigta. But when we look at the selves of other people and other people's aggregates and grasp them as intrinsically existent, those are grasping as intrinsic existence, but those do not constitute jikta. Okay. No.
this is that don't be sure this thing so that the parul go to culture to do culture Tenzin singing tala chuji tandi the kansa tandi ni yu kansa ke Tenzin singing tala ya jikta tang karta kansa Tenzin singing ni chi do ten khatyabra kariya ne jikta la chu kansa ke Tenzin be chap kansa ke Tenzin len jikta in be pha ma chap ta to do no ti kompa hi ku do ga ti ma chap tan jikta singing te nga ta nga yo kharu me ku re se ti se ta kanje to do no ti o tinde chi ki 잡아신도가 양 흉가시 나는 직다다 아니피게 직다다 가사가 단지는 무시든 게든데 샤게 요리 무시 향게든데 요리 다티 거리 인도 매는 두두르 간데 이내면은 랑루 더버나 랑루 더버 셰비나 가사가 단지는 직다인 베점 직달 가사 단지인 베 맞잡 무심마도 무숨마도 지라 무심민도 생계지 다 단다 디해야 일단 디라 콤바네기도가 어디서 요사리 어떠지
So let me try to summarize some of the key points we just talked so far. What we said is this, that there are two forms of grasping as self of persons and grasping as self of phenomena. Okay? Then with regards to grasping as self of person, there are two kinds. Okay? There is grasping at the self of a person in generally we can talk like that, and then the jikta, or grasping at one's own self, if you will. Okay? So those are two different things. Okay? So of course scholars have different viewpoints about these things. According to our system, the relationship we see between grasping at self or person, Kangsak Tenzin, and jikta, view of transitive collection, is in three modes, if you will. The view of transitive collection, jikta, must necessarily be grasping at the self of a person. But every case of the grasping at the self of a person does not necessarily constitute a jikta. Are you with me? Yes. In the debating, we say there's three modes, right? Everything that's a jikta must necessarily be, it prevails that it must be grasping at the self of a person. But every case of grasping at the self of a person does not necessarily have to be jikta. Okay, that's our position. Well, but some other scholars say, no, there's four kinds. Okay, which means they would posit that, well, there's something that is both, something that is neither, something that is one but not the other, see? So they might have different viewpoints. Are you with me? So, boy, we are going to wreck our brain today, but there. No.
다들 안 중대래 송도가 다한테 곡하고 키우도가 다들 가르 송기나 다들 인지날 코세고 요나 마든데 이제 곡하고 신도 가르네 하고 그면도 봐 주다 먹어야 중대래로 중대래 직접로 따와 코나 방자 인라 송도가 주변에 봐 공도 참변 주변 대반 rande되기 직접로 따와 코나 방자 인라 제야 다 메바니도 콘도 추발라서 보네 뽕마른 주로와 히 메바른 주에 메바른 주에 다데 다메 다메바데 다메바데 라완 메바 똑벤 진당 게베 권에 뽕마라 송베 히랍디 독적인 에니피겐 디고소 히랍디 디고 다 간제 키는 마시나 도도도 잡이네 직다생이데 다가때게 나랑서 그 줄라랑 그니 조반 템바도 나오 이제 대 히바 깨기를 받아 야 깨바 가야 마시면 나오 녜지 되다 직다때 돈도 빵 당게 줄라 여러 발 바나 녜 주고 송세세 안으로 들려 텐데 말이스 간데 되잖아 애니 피게 대송고 있었다 도도도 되잖아 히랍팅이 알아요. 동이도비 히랍팅이 알아봐. 동이도비 히랍 제든 딘당 뭐좀 개백이 로직을 뭐지니 돈이 뉴자뉴지도 전에 찍고도 교연도 찍은 가는 거 찍 양어도 교연도 찍은 가는 거 돈이 딘대지기 히딘대지 거라마도 찍기 로인데로도 간제기 비에디 용겨 말이 다 간제 거의 딘당 뭐좀 개백이 고요 알아요. 계속이 여사라봐. 계속이 여러 맨더선자 용절은 제다 코나 뽕라 자원이 대야 간사 그 다미니도 콘디 취베 데레데 뽕만라 간사 그 다음에 번이도 똥바지 또 똥이 콘디 취베네 뽕만 저렇게 똥바니 또베 거니 똥이 콘디 취어 거니 또반 저렇게 맥버른 주르베 다음에 대에 아니 다음에 때 라히메 똑바로 진단 개베 권에 뽕으로 송배 아니 히랍디 독전 진고보 와다 티카테 직다티 가르치는 빠야로 가르치는 히랍디 진단 뭐 직다 코란 진단 뭐 송게 히랍디 야 께네 대빵으로 마도 찍라 로강게 직다 빵토비야요 말에 송기만도 아티 송기자래.
So towards the end of page 214, we have a quotation from Chandrakirti's explanation of the middle way. And I quote, just the view of perishing aggregates, the view of transitory collection, jikta, is to be eliminated, and it is eliminated upon understanding the selflessness of the self, unquote. Okay? And explanation on this and the following lines is jikta, the view of transitory collection, or grasping at one's own self, which is the jikta, is something that needs to be eradicated or eliminated. Okay? And the way we can eliminate it, uproot it from our mind, is by way of cultivating the wisdom realizing selflessness, right, of a person, or the emptiness of self. Okay? And so why is that? Is because the wisdom realizing selflessness of a person and the jikta, right, they are antithetical to each other. When one, exists, other couldn't exist. Yeah? Just, as we look at our jikta, it sees our own self as existing intrinsically, of itself, right? So when we cultivate the wisdom, realizing selflessness, because it sees the self to exist just the opposite of the way, our jikta sees it. So when the wisdom arises in our mind, then our jikta must say goodbye, because it couldn't exist. Because the way they see the self is just the opposite, contradictory, antithetical to one another. So we may develop any other kind of positive attitudes or any other types of wisdom, but they're not going to cut it. Okay? In order to uproot jikta, we must cultivate the wisdom realizing selflessness of a person. Any other wisdom is great, good. Any other positive attitude is great, but that's not going to cut it. Because the wisdom realizing selflessness of a person is the direct antidote to, is the direct antidote to jikta. Yeah, so that's what we need to realize.
오야 대야랑 간사랑기 튕이 두번 된바 임베스 단 직다 튕이 됐자 단지 공도 기본나기 간사랑기 튕이 두번 된바 히르야랑 튕이 두번 된바 임베 히르야비 땡네 아니 랑기 튕이 두번 된베 임베 나오냐든 된바고 랑기 튕이 두번 된바 히르제베 땡기 디땡도 두번부터 나오냐든 된 거래 제일 송버라와 어디 송거냐.
So the jikta, or the view of transitory collection, or the view of perishing aggregates, is focused on one's own self, and we take it for granted that one's own self exists intrinsically in and of itself. So then we, believe in that. That belief of the grasping is the grasping at the self of a person, and also it's the jikta.
어다딘 직다 단 직다들 나시 쳬베나야 나일든 백직다다 나요 안된 백직다 시링이 쳬기도 난딘 직다다 나요 안된 백직다 니신 쳬기여라 봐 쳬기여라 다티 가르치기여다 나일든 백직다 신인데 간데데 숨기 유나 간데데 다단데 나요 가르사다 난딘 직다데 유차리지 명남 직대 유차리지 단 나일든 백직다 신인데 가르세요 손아스다 ngayon benjikta yang ti chone chebra chawo ta ti ngayon benjikta ti ngandi jikta ti chebe topki ngayon be ngai mingna ngai kin ge mingna karsorta ngayo asgor mig ngayo nang ngayo silcheni ta koran yang chebra chton yingodo mig ngayo nawa ngayo na ngayo che ngayo ta lu ngayo wa chen tinde ji ko yore ten jikta te ani ngandi jikta xebe top ye ani ngayon tembe jikta sinye te choni xebra chao sen song doga de wo te insare.
It further explains that when we talk about jikta, the view of perishing aggregates or the transitory view, jikta, of course it is of two kinds. There is the jikta focused on one's own self, which is called the jikta of the self of a person, and the jikta that is focused on one's own aggregates, which constitute the phenomena, so that's the jikta of the self of phenomena. So it's two kinds of jikta. If you really understand it well, our own jikta, the view of perishing, on the view of transitory collection, how self that's simply designated onto our aggregates is taken for granted as existing intrinsically, right, and then grasp at it. That is our jikta. Okay? Then we can also understand how that jikta or the grasping gives rise to, right, grasping at mind. Then we say that, my beautiful eyes. It has to be qualified, right? My eyes, not your eyes. It's my, really. My beautiful eyes, my beautiful flappy ears, my nose, my body, and all of that. So when we attach that possessiveness, my this, my that, so there arises the other form of jikta, right? The jikta that is focused on my aggregates, right, the phenomena. Okay? So that's why, these two types of jikta, the first there arises maybe the jikta of the self of a person, the self referring to us, then that gives rise to the grasping at mind or the jikta of the mind, so my body, my family, my friend, whatever, so all of that, stuff.
다 되게 참대 대송도가야. 나도 녀냠도 민진배 시단 직달은 나도 가요. 그러다 나도 가요. 나섬 딩그러 봐. 걔 민진배야 가르대 된대 민진배였다. 나도 녀냠도 민진배 간사 란자 트비 대유도 좀 받아야 된대 여러 봐. 그러다 오면 되게 간사 란자 트비 대유도 좀 받아야 정도 여러 있어 봐. 이제 간사는 되게 대유도 좀 니 나도 가요 세는 맨디나야 간사 란자 트비 대유도 좀 받아 네 가른데 드리세서나 대야제 로제 영어제 많이 받을 텐데 여러 배서는 대유사 말이 숨겨요. 대유와 말이 금반이 간데서는 간사 다도 몽바이 간사 다도 몽베 마리바 임베 간사 다도 몽베 대야 마리바 임베 영어제 많이 받을 menju로 양 가게 간사 란자 트비 대유도 좀 받지 양제 영어제 많이 받던데 유지리서 텐데 공기와 메로 근데 요 말이 나도 가요 시민팀be 이메이나 가사라냐 트비 대유트 반데 받지 로티 녀모체 리세네 어디 숨고요 사리.
So then on top of page 215, a clarification is offered. That is, now how about grasping at substantially independently wait a minute, I'll do it again. How about grasping at self-sufficient and substantially existent self of a person? Okay, now we change the terms, isn't it, here? In the Buddhist schools of thought, there are some schools said, well, there is self-sufficient, substantially existent person. We call Rangja Thube Zeyu, right? Rangja means independent, self-sufficient. Zeyu is substantially existent self. Okay? And some of them might assert that conception of grasping is not a delusion. It's not an afflictive emotion. Okay? But according to our system, no. Well, that is still a delusional mind. Okay? Yes, we know that's not the same as grasping at the intrinsic self of a person and intrinsic self of phenomena. That's not what it is, but still that is also a delusional state of mind. Yes, a clarification is offered.
Oh, this is that. There's a ranking order ranking tamla tadu shakwa tang. Now nyamba tamjilu yula tadu shakwa ni yare, starting dina, sitan dindan talate, loin dindan la, 대단 랑기 오 주베 랑신 저바 랑신 땀라 다도 장고 찍여리스 다디 각자티라바 가잔티테기 로티라바 양 가시에게 나오 냥바 땀지 로라 다담게 바세바 니레스 나티 양지 가게 체바라 맨든 버티기 맨로 나오 냐베 로직 틴데 니레스 당고네 리베 가제 인라스 시만이 타니도 요바 인노 와다티 당보티 에네 리베 가제 세야들이 메주 각자 메주 각자들이 시만 나오 냠바 땀라 에네 당 대랑 팅 주바tin 비비 찹게요 말이 디 제바 인자 될라 에네 비게 타니도 요베 나텔라 야제 나오 냠베데 라히지 주바tin 비 나치 지라와 각자한테 보지 야 멤베야 타니도 nga se ji oro ta ke kaya min de nga o tinde ni yobe sema de tani de be kakja re mar kakja ma se tani de be nga re sung ge sare.
So then in the next the second paragraph from the top on 215 there's a mention of what called maybe two types of conception of I or self. Okay, now one is seeing self as intrinsically existent. Okay, so that we said is something that needs to be eliminated because there is no intrinsic self. Okay, and so that constitutes the object of negation by reasoning. Okay, so through reasoning we said there is not such a self. That, but there is possibility for simply sense of I, the notion of I. Okay, which is actually what we call the conventional I. So when we experience sense of I, it doesn't always necessarily have to be, I think, the intrinsic self of the I, because there is a conventional self of the I, and we might experience that, oh, it's me, I, right? So we have to make a distinction between those two notions of I or a self, if you will.
That is it. tenang jikta henji ji mikpa mingok pa tongchi di namba dintang ni rangi ngo tuwe ini nga yinpe di ngok pa mendes dan jikta henji sana nga chi yorwa le yang nga jimpe jimbat tin jipka henji ki mikpa chiwe nga di meb so yorwa sana di yor maris nga di tingdo rangi chi tuban rangon di tuban jimpe jimbat di kag yor ma do nga korang ini pike chi kag yor maris ungi yotarwa 현재지 mikpa gokpa tongchi di namban dintang ni rangi ngo tuwe rangi nga yinpe da di kare suki nga yinpe eni da di gokpa mente da kanchi di gokpa maresi di gokpa mentang kare sana pena sungdowa pena tra tanji ki mikpa tra mingo chans tra tanji ki mikpa tra tanji talaya kundal hingi tiri yujirawa tak hotel tiga gunda mes ada wat ke mentira kanje tatanji ki soba tatanji ji mikpa tra mingo chance ti hian yu tra takbang go ba mingge ba hino wata kanje nadil henji ji mikpa chube ngade mingo chance ti tindang ti chube ani pige ji ti kanje juban ti mentira ti go ba res ngad go ko mari chane ti res tana tra takban ti tanji teli ani tra takba ti khar segura ngokbo re ma to chela ta koram be ba son ka ge yo ma re so wa ti ni pe no ti chan de wa la ho ti tre
So we're in the second paragraph from the top on page 215 where it is explained that there are two notions of I or self. Right, there is the notion of I or self as being intrinsically existent, which constitute the object of negation by reasoning. But then there is the notion of conventional I or the self, which we are not trying to refute because it exists. Okay? So what's happening is this, that there is I or conventional self, but we misperceive that I or the self to exist in and of itself. Okay? So we are trying to refute our misperception of the self, not the self itself, because the conventional self exists, and we are not trying to refute that. Yeah, what we are trying to refute is our own misperceived notion of the self. Now, a very good example is given here. For example, it says, if we misperceive sound as permanent, okay, and we try to establish that sound is impermanent, not permanent, what we're really doing is we are refuting or challenging this misperception of sound as permanent, but we are not refuting sound, because sound exists, isn't it? Sound exists, it is impermanent. It's just that we think there is a permanent sound. Well, there is no permanent sound. So that permanent sound is the referent object, technical term, 显有, of our misperception. And once we refute that referent object, permanent sound, then that misperception also goes away. In the same way, intrinsic self is the referent object, right? It doesn't exist, but we think it exists. But once we know there is no such intrinsic I of the self, okay, then our misperception of that self also, goes away. So are you with me so far? So there is a conventional I of the self which we respect, we accept it, it exists. Okay? We simply misperceive it as intrinsically existed, and we're trying to get rid of our misperception of that self. So that, I think, example really works very well. Yeah.
Oh yeah. That chana papa yapse dance, that papa yapse lobondawa, lobon ludu tantini, Khensuruta, Koyirota, or the Hugamitu, Chindu, Lamsan, Chindu. Get an papa yapse, the loboni, Shung, Ranshinji, Yuba tongue. That Tanji Kazi, Con, Yuba Chilia, Ranshinji, Yuba, Kiana Ram, Maleba, Ranking Oni, Chitova, Santabuti, Namdan, Mangus Songala. What is Sungi Saravate? Shuni Ranshinji Yubata, Ranking O Yubatang, Yonatang. Ranking Chinji Yubata, that's Yunaki, Kakra Songbe, Ranshin La Songbe, Nambanga, Temper Tetabu, River Chalas, what up to Meba Temper Chalas. Teda Meba Tombe, Tignamji, Tonya, any Mirik Base, Teda Meba Rashiji by your Mari. Rang Tini to your marriage in the Mebar Tombe Gita, Dotenju Kain, take day, any character, Toya, any Mirik by Hina, Miracle Hina, Tetra Maris, they dig Maris, take the gay your race, Tommy by Yamba Tarki, Yamba Taki, Tommy by Tomba Tabur, cover Michao, take the any on your Maribeti. Rangi man, they take the tongue, take the Rangi or Maribe, the sent Telechana Tom, Telechevina, a day in a character, cover a Misha watch in Sungi, that in the Chena, so to Tombra Tetabuni, cover a Misha watch and that day, suggested those. Tattering Takashalbe.
And to watch Shunarova.
No,
any I saw Pugova.
Oh, what did Tapungi? The Saje Tanguchik those.
No,
Saje Tango Kazin Saje New Tanguta, Kisham La Gaja. Any Siana Jormi Jorosiatic Ligiori.
So in the third paragraph from the top on 215, it is stated that when masters such as Arya Nagarjuna, Arya Deva, Chandrakirti, Buddhapalita, right, and these are the names often we cite. In their works or the literatures, and we have seen the use of these different terminologies earlier also, right? They all boil down to the same thing. Sometimes, we hear them say there is what we call if things exist as intrinsically, the Tibetan term is Rangshinji Yuba, existing sort of by its own nature, if you will. If things existed essentially, that's like, things have their own identity kind of thing, right? Essentially, from their own side. If things exist by way of their own intrinsic characteristics, so these are different terminologies used by them in their works, but all of them referring to the same thing, right? There isn't something that exists, on its own without relying upon something else, other things, okay? And so that clarification is offered. And so even though things don't exist, by way of their own characteristics, from their own side, essentially, intrinsically, but still we grasp at them, basically that constitutes our ignorance. Things may never exist, don't exist that way, but we still, take for granted and see them as existing in those modes. So that is our ignorance. Okay, and we need to eliminate that ignorance. So with that, we complete a major point there, and because we also need to do talk later, so we will stop there. And the next point, major point, we will pick up for next time is when to add qualifications to the objects of negation. Okay, we will deal with that. And so we will stop there, and we will take one or two questions, right? And then we will do the talk. I have a prayer request here, which I will, I think, announce at the talk. Is Branka's, sister Lily's sister, Branka, passed away in Serbia on May 25th, and so we'll pray for her during the talk. 근데 통밀점주 쉬어야지. 당아주 기루지면로 릴리 세겐디기 분자 브랑가 세겐지 룽바프게 총동안. 니승알디 통밀점주인데 초하고 쉬쇼.
일단 초 그거라.
Okay. Yes, very
good. When we were talking about the intellectual grasping versus the innate grasping at the view of transitory collection, we referenced the lower schools. Like one of them, we gave us an example of the intellectual, but we didn't say what the Prasangika school says the intellectual grasping is of Vyotan.
Okay. Morangi di kandi shudu. Tadagi dirawa nganzu ben jigdala chasamen jigdala ya ane kuinta da lenje ni shabarwa. Sidu kanli ya an jigda kuinta ki da pechun rabsa sayadili ya tadagi chirabagi di nangzenbegi karata tangzebarwe. Mambuku ba di sungsungwa pechun shabarwa. Ina nganazu tenjube ranglu ya ane jigda kuinta di ngunji rabu chingmasa di kante dis ngunji chigunasa. Tenjube lu jigda kuinta ngunji.
tenjube lu jigda kuinta yari. Tachida kuinta del henji seyati rangi lu topki chebe cheta sunggengi dire chegre bala. Cheni chetan lu sunu tan dire chi resha samya ki din bachi orba. Kela kuinta toni man diung gerbal. Ate chebal matu ba nganga shushu ki pin diung gete henji ki diung gerbal. Tana tholam ki kapsu ya pyungchok tundu ina kuinta tundu pang gerbal. Pang du bala tati karsa ta cheni rang kitan tupta le mali tupta ki sha ma sha se ji orbal ta ti se che top kin timba ta nan ji che ba che tan dinre chi le wu mi du sa ya diung ki tala kuinta diung ya tri ta tan nganga shushu ki diung ya te henji ki diung ya ji ya tan ji te ta ma mangbu ki be te bal pe shan sha bra wa tu ta o me tu be
ta tenju be kuinta ke pe shan ka shon ka sa da jigda kuinta ke pe shan ka de sha bona
ta pe na ka na nganga shushu ki timba tra ta ngama te che tan timba tra che be tan timba di tan dire ji yu
ne da che ne dire le sno
dire ji koran lep tu tan dire ta to bon me tu ta te garan re sha sa me che tan timba tra ta.
According to the Prasangika Madhyamika schools, the intellectually formed, the jigda, I think it can be like any kind of intellectual opinions, viewpoints that we hold based upon our own thinking or investigations, or based upon studying some system with regard to one's own self. The innate one is, we don't need any education, anything. It just naturally pops up, right? That's what it is. But the intellectual one is, maybe we are brilliant mind or something. We just kind of think about, I think maybe myself exists in this particular way, right? So if we think that way, that is the intellectual form. Or maybe it comes through, studying some other schools of thought. Or it might come through one's own thinking. I'm thinking about the self. I think maybe this is how the self exists. So that becomes the intellectual form of jigda. Yeah, very good. One more question? Okay, if not, we will stop there and namsan di cho so na so kusan na and so
so
so I said, we will take like
just want to add one more name.
Yeah.
Person to think of. His name is
Richie
Richie Wu.
Wu, okay.
Richie Wu. He jumped out of the second floor.
Oh, ale
Fired it last night.
no the tunde yang tumen jamje de yang ji gi kangba to za ma sa ni shibda dong Richie Wu sa long. Thank you. Before I forget, because some of you may not stay for the talk, I think GSTDL has already sent through the, whatever that's called, Yahoo groups or Mahu groups, whatever the list, that I think Friday, correct me if it is, right? It's the full moon. Whenever that full moon is, we are going to have another talk special here. Okay, I think 7:30, and so you're welcome to that talk also. So we are doing a lot of talks, which is good for this month. Yang teri did seven chunga de sapasang kekuri yang chojo yang di konse tense school.
Sakadawa.
Sakadawa. Yeah, so that's the real Sakadawa day. We think about the full. Okay. So I'll do the short form of dedication. Okay. What is that? Sa ji be ji zhe ji me do zhang rui ra lin xi yin de jian ba de sang jie xin do me de bu ba yin ru gui nam da xin la jue ba shuo yi dang gu ru ra na man de la gang ni ya da ya me ye wo de Khensur Rinpoche ma je ba no je ju je wa nyam ba me ba ya kon ne kon do te wa jo to nie da wa Rinpoche ma je ba no je ju je wa nyam ba me ba na kon ne kon do be wa jo kan re ra be go be shin kan de ben dan de wa ma le ju be ne Tenzin Okay, 10 minutes break to set up the table more or call the natures.